Thank you very much. Thank you, Dennis, for inviting me, to Shona for her wonderful lecture, and Mike for kicking us off so well with the UK perspective. So I feel like in some senses I've got the short straw here, because often we're told that we're not even supposed to ask ourselves what the role of England should be, because it's just so complicated. Just don't even bother asking the English question, let alone try and answer it. So I am going to try and ask it. I'm not necessarily going to give you a definitive answer, but I'm hoping I can give some kind of pointers, both as to why the English question is so difficult, why I think we need to confront it at the moment, and also some thoughts as to how we might think more creatively about the potential role of England in the United Kingdom. So first, why is it we don't even want to ask ourselves why England should have a special role, or what England's special role should be in the United Kingdom? And I guess there's sort of three real reasons. First, we don't necessarily see ourselves as having the same English political identity as we see a clear Scottish, Welsh, or Northern Irish identity. Partly that's for historical reasons, but I think also it's because often we feel in England a greater connection to our regions than we do to the nation. So if someone asks me, I'm quite happy to say I'm a Yorkshire lass, but I'm not necessarily going to tell you I'm an English woman. I'll say I'm from Yorkshire on the United Kingdom. And even when we had referendums within regional greater support, there was very little support across the regions for greater devolved assemblies. So we don't seem to have this great connection to local and regional politics, even if we do have a connection to regional areas. And often when we think about national politics, we don't necessarily think about English politics, we think about UK politics. Second, I think even when we tried to find an answer to the English question, it didn't necessarily work. And I'm obviously talking here of what Shona Douglas-Scott mentioned in her lecture, the infamous English votes for English laws, which were introduced through a standing order in Parliament in 2015 and quietly disappeared in July 2021 with little debate, no division, and no one really noticing in the national media. And it's hardly surprising that English votes for English laws disappeared. Its rules were complex, they were difficult to apply. There were all sorts of downsides of trying to think of crossover issues that crossed into funding that comes from the Barnett formula. Also, when you're looking at a double veto, when you have English and Westminster MPs voting on something, it's hard to see that as necessarily giving us distinct English voice or English Parliament. And despite having these wonderful legislative grand committees, you could see from the research there was very little debate or engagement in these committees. So very little time was spent trying to find a distinct English voice, even if we can necessarily find it in the first place. And if you wanted to be cynical, there's no real need to answer the English question within the Westminster Parliament if you've got an English majority as well as a UK majority. So there isn't necessarily any great political desire in those circumstances to think about how we listen to or find a distinct English voice. And third, as has already been mentioned, even if we were to move towards a federal structure and explore this idea that Mike has suggested between federalism and sovereignty, it's still going to be very difficult to work out what the distinct English role should be because of the great asymmetries in GDP, geography, and population. And if we then think, well, why don't we counter that with greater regional representation, you then get to the stage of just how fragmented will this federal structure be and how difficult or easy will it be to listen to all these voices? And will we still have too much power tipped in favour of the Southeast? So that brings me to my second point. We don't like to ask the question, but nevertheless, I want to say that at the moment we really should. And that's because I think we can see an emerging English identity post-Brexit. And again, I think this has come from a number of factors. So first, we like to point out that the Union has been put under pressure because Scotland and Northern Ireland voted differently from England and Wales in the Brexit referendum. But we need to look more closely. Amongst England, there was also a big disparity between those who voted to remain in the EU and those who voted to leave. So we often talk about this. I've heard it called the Loxbridge Triangle, which is a bit hard to explain, but the idea of London, Oxford and Cambridge, who were very much for staying within the EU, and the rest of England that wasn't necessarily all that willing to do so. And the vote divided, in particular, not just on age and education levels, but also social backgrounds. So I've told you I'm a Yorkshire lass, I come from Sheffield, and if you look at the vote in Sheffield, the vote for and against remaining in the EU split in terms of the more affluent and the more socially deprived areas of Sheffield. So there's very much a feeling that those who voted to leave the EU felt that their voices were being ignored, their English voices from areas that weren't necessarily tied into the southeast or areas of economic success. They felt left behind. I think that feeling is still there. And it didn't just come from the referendum. It was starting to forge all the way through austerity measures, where you had lots of hits on local and regional councils. You had aspects of consultation exercises as to how to deal with these austerity measures. And I think this again formed this voice of those who are not London, who wanted to have their voices put across and to have a greater say in how to deal with these austerity issues. We also have local devolution. So we've moved to systems of elected mayors. These devolution deals are bespoke within a particular framework, focusing on greater powers on planning, regional transport, skills and training, business support, and economic development. And where this has happened, again, you can see a forging of regional interests, of explaining that England is not just the southeast. And you can see this, I think, most starkly across the COVID pandemic. So we've seen it not just in the sense of when we can have local councils giving local regionalised solutions or taking local directions in response to where the pandemic is hitting in certain areas, but you've also seen certain mayors, so everybody knows now Andy Burnham, Greater Manchester's Metro Mayor, who's willing to intervene and suggest that perhaps funding hasn't been distributed down to the regions and the way that it has been. So I think there's a growing regionalised, not London English voice. So if it's there, we have to think about how best can we incorporate this. And this brings me to my third point. If we have to ask ourselves the English question, how are we going to go about resolving it? Well, clearly we need to come up with something better than this idea of English votes for English laws. I think we also need to think a little bit more clearly about what the nature of the problem is. And I think here, this is where Shona Douglas Scott framework of understanding self and shared rule could be really important. Because I think what we're missing is this idea of a regional level between the local and national politics. And I think what we're also missing is a way of ensuring these voices, be they local or regional, are actually able to feed into national debate, and not just with Westminster, but also taking account of debates in the devolved legislatures, particularly for those regional areas that are on the borders between England and Wales, England and Scotland, and all of us with Northern Ireland. We're all in a big border with Northern Ireland in a sense, particularly now post-Brexit. So if this is the way forward, how are we going to achieve this? And I'd like to suggest two possible ways. I think first, we need to make sure we do have that middle layer in politics, the regional level between the local and the national level. And second, I think we need to think about how we're going to get more effective communication networks between the local, regional, and national levels, as well as building on these links with devolved legislatures and governments. And I think if we're going to get there, we need a much wider consultation about what regional politics we need and how we get these special localised devolution solutions, building on what we've already started with elected mayors. And second, I think, again, we need much better frameworks, and again, possibly on a statutory and not just on an informal basis. They could be within Parliament, so we could have more regional committees picking up on these voices, perhaps initiating debates, or perhaps scrutinising legislation and raising issues where we think that national legislation might pose regional problems and might need us to go away and consult with the regions as to how they're going to implement these policies so everybody benefits and we achieve them across the nation and not just in certain pockets of the United Kingdom. But I think importantly, we need to make sure that the national level is listening to the regional level with proper interchanges and exchanges of information. And perhaps that brings me to the biggest problem of all. If we're going to resolve the English question and come up with a solution, I think we have to think about it less as empowering the English and more about listening to the many diverse English regional voices and allowing them to influence and implement national policy developments effectively. Thank you very much.